Highway 20 is the longest road in the United States. It stretches across the country for a staggering 5,415 kilometers, passing through 12 states and countless cities. At times, the highway passes through dead zones, like in the state of Oregon, sparsely populated places isolated from the rest of the world, surrounded by dense, impenetrable forests. Driving along these stretches of Highway 20 is unsettling, especially at night. You start to wonder what terrible secrets these forests might be hiding. One evening in 1977, the 20-year-old Marlene Gabrielson left her young daughter with friends in her hometown of Lebanon, Oregon, and went with her husband to a party on a farm 130 kilometers away. It was an all-American kind of party, with horseback riding, live music, and a real rodeo with live bulls, and Marlene had a few drinks. In the middle of the party, Marlene and her husband got into an argument about something, and Marlene decided to return home alone. She went around the farm asking friends and acquaintances if anyone could give her a lift. It turned out that a man with a pickup truck was also about to go home, and he agreed to give her a lift back to Lebanon. At that moment, Marlene didn't suspect anything untoward. The guy was not much older than her and seemed pretty normal. And anyway, Marlene was preoccupied with the thought of seeing her little girl again. And so the young people got into the truck and hit the road. True, as she got into the pickup, Marlene noticed that there was no door handle on the passenger door and no way to open the window. But she didn't think twice about it. In old vehicles like this, you never know what may be broken. Little did she know, she had just fallen into a terrible trap. The route from the farm back to Lebanon passed along a particularly narrow, winding stretch of Highway 20. At night, it's completely dark. The few exits from the highway lead to sawmills and campsites, and there is no landmarks or residential areas anywhere nearby. Outside the truck windows, only darkness, trees flying past merging into an endless dark green blur. In front of the vehicle, only a small patch of asphalt lit up by the headlights. Marlene, lulled by the repetitive scenery and the soft rumble of the car, falls asleep. She wakes up suddenly. The man is trying to drag her out of the car by the ankles. He grabs her by the hair and threatens her with a knife, ordering her to do whatever he asks. He pulls the waist of her jeans and slashes it with the knife, cutting them in two, and commands Marlene to look him in the eyes while he does his dirty work. Marlene looks around her for a brief moment. The tall trees, a small flower meadow nearby. How could you hurt a person in such a beautiful place, she thinks. When the man stops, he wipes the sweat from his forehead and mutters, "Well, what should we do with you now?" Marlene simply replies, "Take me home." Marlene's desire to stay alive was strong. Being left alone, half naked in the forest in the middle of the night, seemed like an even worse option than getting back in the car. The man gave her a pair of all-dirty pants and gestured her to get into the car. She obeyed. Back on the road, Marlene tried to stay calm. She knew that the man had a knife and a pistol in his pocket, but it seemed like he wouldn't use them. Instead of threatening her further, the man asked Marlene if she would be his girlfriend. Of course, she nodded without hesitating, anything to stay safe. Marlene asked to be taken to her mother-in-law's house. As soon as they pulled up and Marlene got out, the pickup truck driver drove off. Marlene ran up to the house. Her mother-in-law opened the door, and she was terrified by what she saw. Marlene was covered in dirt, her hair was tangled up in branches and grass, and she was wearing an old pair of men's pants instead of her own jeans. She explained what had just happened, and her mother-in-law suggested that she immediately take a bath to wash off all the dirt and the horror of the experience. But Marlene refused. Instead, she went to the hospital where the doctors examined her, took DNA for analysis, and made a record of her injuries. Now Marlene could relax a little and take a shower, reassured in the hope that the police would head off to track down the rapist. But it was not to be. They called Marlene to the station several times and subjected her to lengthy interrogations using a lie detector. She brought them her ripped jeans and underwear as evidence, but they were not convinced. In the end, they concluded that the young girl was lying. The fact is that Marlene was a member of the indigenous population. She had no one to turn to for help, and unfortunately, back then, and today too, some people held strong prejudices against people like Marlene. Apparently, she was subjected to this discrimination. Later, she would say that she felt like a ghost in this situation. Nobody paid her any attention, nobody heard her innocent cries, and even direct evidence was dismissed as false. It was incredibly painful. Nevertheless, Marlene survived, the first and last person to come out of an encounter with this pickup truck driver alive. On that note, the pickup truck was quickly identified, and its owner was discovered to be a certain John Arthur Ackroyd, a maintenance worker out on Highway 20. Previously, he worked as a welder. He was a rather unremarkable person. After the incident with Marlene, he was called in for questioning and asked to take a polygraph test. But the police didn't find any signs that he was lying and decided to believe him over Marlene. John claimed that everything that happened between him and Marlene was a matter of mutual consent and ripped jeans. He didn't see any. The police didn't press any charges. Marlene's husband, however, tracked him down and beat him up. Meanwhile, Marlene had to live with the memories of that awful night. She constantly thought about how her assailant was still on the loose and could find her at any moment. Pretty soon, she decided to leave town. The following year, 1978, another woman went missing on Highway 20, the 35-year-old Katie Turner. She worked as a manager and was also a huge fan of running. In the mid-70s, she and her friends took up running in a serious way, even participating in marathons. For Kay, running became a way of life. She went running every morning, not skipping it even in the coldest winter days. That Christmas, Kay and her husband went to spend the holiday at the Sherman campsite near the town of Sisters, not far from the farm where Marlene was picked up a year earlier. Waking up at this campsite on the morning of December 23rd, Kay decided to go for her morning run as always. She called a friend to join her, but her friend refused. It was too cold outside. It's not known which route Kay took. She told her husband and friends that she would be back in an hour. But when 2 hours had passed and she still wasn't back, her loved ones began to worry. They realized that something was wrong. Perhaps she had got injured or fallen into a ditch. They quickly searched the woods near their cabin, but finding no sign of her there, they called the police. When the police arrived at the scene, some local teenagers who were also at the campsite told them to contact a certain John Ackroyd. Apparently, he was the last person to see the woman. The detectives went looking for this John and found his car next to the road which most probably Kay had been running on that morning. They interrogated him and discovered that he really had seen the woman, but he had nothing to say about her disappearance, and the police believed him. What was he doing there anyway? In an interrogation with the police 14 years later, Ackroyd himself explained his visit to the campsite by saying that he was hunting deer with his friend Roger Beck. Supposedly, Roger was completely broke and his children were starving, so Ackroyd decided to go hunting with him since Beck didn't have a gun. On his way to the campsite, Ackroyd saw Kay Turner running along the highway. Over the course of various conversations, John's story about that morning changed several times. Either he stopped to chat with her, or drove past her several times on his way to get gas, and even almost hit her dog by accident. However, about her disappearance, he had nothing to say. Generally, Ackroyd was a good hunter. In conversations with the police, he often talked about hunting and how he could follow the tracks of various animals. One of the detectives reported how it seemed obvious that John's hunting skills could be used for more than just deer. He knew how to handle weapons so well. But for now, let's return to 1979, when Kay's friends and family organized a massive search for her. Just 2 weeks before her disappearance, she left a note to her father. This was to be her last message. It read, "Hi Dad, I love you, Kay." The woman disappeared, leaving only a few Nike footprints on the ground, and next to them, some huge men's footprints were found. It seemed like at some point, Kay was literally dragged along the ground. The police went through all of Kay's personal belongings, looking for clues. They soon discovered that Kay had a couple of lovers who she often spent time with and even went on trips with. So now the detectives had 5 suspects all at once: Kay's husband, her 2 boyfriends, and their wives. Meanwhile, the strange deer hunter quickly faded into the background. In the end, the police focused on Kay's husband, Noel Turner. A man who discovered that his beloved wife had betrayed him could certainly attack her in a fit of rage. They didn't even search the woods near where she had been running. However, Kay's body was never found, and as you know, no body, no case. The days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. And right when the unsolved case seemed to about fade into history, 8 months after the incident, John Ackroyd himself entered the store in the Sherman campsite and said that he had found a body in the forest. The police finally started paying attention to this hunter. It struck them as odd that John reported an awful smell coming from the remains, when in fact such a smell was impossible. When Ackroyd brought them to the place, there were only bones, and only some of these bones could be identified as the remains of a girl. Did this mean that Ackroyd found the body of Kay Turner before he said he did? The police noticed this inconsistency, of course, as well as the fact that John was absolutely sure that he had found the missing girl, even though it just looked like a pile of clothes, some bones, a broken watch, and a bird's nest made of light-colored hair. Being a hunter, Ackroyd must have found similar stuff on multiple occasions. Old clothes, garbage, and animal bones could be found in any forest. How could he be so sure that it was her? And yet, the police discovered that they were in fact Kay's remains. Ackroyd was certain that the bones were human, but for the police, it was impossible to be sure just by looking at them. Only a thorough analysis would prove it, so Ackroyd now became the prime suspect, and they let Kay's husband go. They brought Ackroyd in for questioning, and he completely failed the lie detector test. After that, he started to change his story. He said that he actually found the girl's body back in February, lying in the snow. He described everything in shocking detail, the signs of decay, and how wild animals had found her before he did. Ackroyd even described what he thought had happened to the girl. He reported noticing traces of a shot wound. Judging by the level of detail in his description, it almost seemed like he had seen the whole thing with his own eyes, and this time he was telling the truth. When the police asked him why he didn't say anything earlier, he replied that he just didn't want to become a suspect. However, despite Ackroyd's shocking confession, the detectives had no evidence to incriminate him, and they couldn't arrest him, especially since he refused to answer any more questions and demanded a lawyer. So they let him go, and the case of Kay Turner remained unsolved. Ackroyd continued working as a highway maintenance man on Highway 20, driving his pickup truck up and down that winding road, and so it would be for another 10 years. Meanwhile, another person disappeared in July 1990, but this time it wasn't a random passerby, but John Ackroyd's own stepdaughter, Rachanda. That year, there was a terrible accident on Highway 20, a multi-car crash in which a young girl died. John Ackroyd arrived on the scene to help with the wreckage in his role as highway maintenance. A police officer who was also present knew that Ackroyd was suspected of assaulting women and had an unusual idea. He asked Ackroyd to help him get the girl's body out of the car. The officer wanted to see how Ackroyd reacted. "She's so light," Ackroyd exclaimed, picking up the girl, "just like Rachanda." The policeman hearing this raised his eyebrows in surprise. Rachanda had already been missing for several months at that time. She went missing on July 10, 1990. 3 days after her disappearance, while being interrogated by the police, Ackroyd talked about what might have happened to her. An undesirable character would see a chance that there is a nice-looking girl that is getting developed, take a chance and see nobody else is around and just walk right out to the car with her. Cause 78 pounds is nothing for somebody to carry. And a little girl like that, what fight is she gonna put up? Somebody, somebody my size, your size, even smaller, you could punch them and they're just gonna crumple. You hit them over the head, they have no fight, Rachenda Pickle was 13 at the time of her disappearance. She loved animals, enjoyed helping her mom around the house, and was especially close to her brother Byron. According to the recollections of friends and relatives, Rachenda was a very sweet little girl who laughed a lot and was interested in fashion and music. Rachenda's mother Linda was the only breadwinner in the family. She divorced Rachenda's biological father and did not have any steady relationship until she met John Ackroyd. Linda married John in 1985 and moved into his rather isolated residence with her children. It was a huge warehouse full of highway maintenance equipment where the families of highway workers lived. The family lived at the intersection of Highway 20 with Highway 22, about 40 kilometers from the town of Sisters. Now Linda and her children finally had a real home and some stability, although they still struggled to make ends meet. Linda liked John. Before that, she had only had unhappy relationships with men, but Ackroyd treated her well. She wanted her children to grow up with enough food on the table, and it seemed like this wish was fulfilled in her marriage to John. But while Linda treasured the relationship, for her children, living with John was hell. According to acquaintances, Ackroyd was always very calm and reasonable, but according to the recollections of Byron, Rachenda's brother, Ackroyd became aggressive, cruel, and dangerous behind closed doors. Rachenda and Byron went to school in Sweet Home. According to Rachenda's school friend Michelle, one day she came to school with a tuft of hair torn out, and another day with bruises and scratches all over her face. Rachenda admitted that her stepfather John did it. Linda, however, did not seem to care. In her eyes, her children had a good relationship with John. He often took them fishing, and she turned a blind eye to all the rest. Rachenda and Byron's mother was truly a strange woman who completely suppressed any negative memories of John. Watching her interview with the Oregonian, you can tell that this is a woman who lost her daughter and whose husband was suspected of atrocious crimes. By the way, Ackroyd himself said that he disciplined children with his fists, and Linda herself told him to use this method. With time, the beatings became more and more frequent, and once Ackroyd even broke an alarm clock on Rachenda. According to Byron, only then did Linda stand up for Rachenda, asking John to stop. Later, Linda admitted in an interview that she often noticed how John's eyes would become darker, and he would mutter that he wanted to kill someone. Rachenda and Byron were terrified of John and never wanted to go home. Rachenda always got sad when the school day ended. Her friends suspected that Ackroyd came into her room at night, and it's not hard to guess what happened there. She didn't even want to be at home in the daytime. Once, she told everything to a friend and asked to stay at her place. When the morning came and it was time to go home, she hid in the closet, hoping that Linda would not find her and would let her stay another day. Her fear and disgust of John was so strong. On that occasion, she got lucky. Linda let her stay with her friend another day. In the end, Rachenda and her brother came up with a plan. They would run away as soon as they turned 18. Alas, Rachenda didn't make it that far. In the summer of 1990, Byron and Rachenda spent some time with their biological father, Stephen Pickle, who started asking them about their life at home as soon as they arrived. Stephen had already heard rumors about the unhealthy interest of Ackroyd and Linda's other former boyfriends in Rachenda, so he decided to ask her directly if any of them had approached her. Rachenda told him everything. Stephen was naturally horrified and wanted to bring the children to live with him, but without success, Rachenda asked to go back to her mom. Back home, the nightmares with Ackroyd in her room continued, but Rachenda said practically nothing to her friends. However, one day she could stand it no longer and complained to her father, Stephen. He called Linda and threatened to take the children away. Linda told Ackroyd about the call, and Rachenda was in for a new kind of hell. Now she understood that she could not stay at home alone any longer. A few days after the call, she completely disappeared. On that day, Richenda was supposed to be at home with her brother, but she stayed late at school, and John, on the contrary, came home early, so they were left alone. According to Ackroyd, he suggested that they go to the forest to photograph deer. She refused, so he went alone. When he returned home with his wife, Richenda was not there. His colleagues on the highway told that he left work early, saying that he had not received the parts he needed for a job. However, this excuse caught the attention of his co-workers, since he could easily find something else to do on the road. Anyway, they let him go and he went home. Later, having come to the forest alone to photograph deer, his colleagues saw him getting out of his pickup truck with a camera. Then he got back in the truck and went home again. Realizing that Richenda might have run away or disappeared, Linda and John began to think about what to do. John reassured Linda, saying there is no need to call the police because a missing child can only be reported after 24 hours. Linda believed her husband, although this was a complete lie. A missing child should be reported as soon as possible, but Linda only dialed 911 a day later, and the operator was clearly shocked by the mother's calmness and the fact that she had not called earlier. Naturally, Ackroyd was called in for interrogation, but he had an alibi. He had been seen with a camera at the moment the girl allegedly disappeared. But what if he had deliberately arranged everything so that his colleagues saw him at that moment? During the interrogation, Ackroyd spoke with pleasure about what might have happened to Richenda. Perhaps some sick person took her, seeing her as an easy victim. When asked by the search team, he couldn't remember her birthday, but he could immediately remember her bra and waist size. John didn't seem to be at all worried about the girl. That evening, after all the interrogation and searches, he took his wife to bed in an unusually unrestrained manner, despite the fact that, according to Linda, they had had problems with their intimate life until that day. The strange coincidences did not end there. A few days later, Richenda's jeans were found, and the police showed them to Ackroyd. His eyes lit up, and embarrassed, he covered the wet spot, which formed immediately on the crotch of his pants. But they couldn't find Richenda herself. The district attorney then formed a special police unit whose only task was to finally put Ackroyd behind bars. There was still no direct evidence that he was involved. Then Ackroyd himself got involved in the search for Richenda. The police hoped that, once in the forest, he would accidentally reveal some information about the girl, but they already knew that there was no more chance of finding her alive. Ackroyd really enjoyed being part of the search team and continued to share his eerily precise guesses about what could have happened to his stepdaughter. Perhaps someone hid her body, covering her with branches. Maybe her attacker was attracted by the fact that she began to develop so early. The search gave no answers. Then the detectives decided to reopen the case of Kay Turner. Maybe they had missed some clues. They had to put Ackroyd behind bars as soon as possible. They knew that now it was a race against time, because he would definitely attack again. They had to stop him before anything else happened. But they were already too late. Highway 20 was John Ackroyd's hunting ground. He spent a lot of time here, driving through the forests alone. He knew it well. The police believed that he was responsible for many more lives. They just didn't find all of them. Obviously, Ackroyd wasn't stupid. After the attack on Marlene, he stopped leaving his victims alive. And after the Kay Turner case, he decided not to bring the police to the crime scene in the forest. Among themselves, the detectives started calling him a serial killer. At least 12 years had passed between the disappearance of Kay Turner and Richenda Pickle. Had Ackroyd been sitting quietly in his pickup for the last 12 years? Hard to believe. In 2012, two Lincoln County investigators reopened an old case involving the disappearance of two young girls, Melissa Sanders and Sheila Swanson. They disappeared in the spring of 1992 at a campsite near the town of Newport, where they were vacationing with Melissa's parents. One evening, the girls got bored and decided to head back to Newport, where they often had dinner at a diner called Sherry's. Funnily enough, John Ackroyd was also a regular of this diner. He knew Melissa and Sheila and was there almost every evening. The locals nicknamed him Perv Everyone knew that he only came to this diner to chat with young girls. So, on that fateful day, Melissa and Sheila decided to leave the campsite at night by hitchhiking. When their parents woke up in the morning and didn't find the girls in the tent, they thought they must have called their friends to pick them up. However, the girls' friends said that yes, the girls had called them, but they couldn't pick them up. The clueless parents spent another week camping, not knowing that Sheila and Melissa never made it home. While the search for the girls was going on, Ackroyd was working in Newport and passing by the missing posters with their pictures. He often was heard to mutter under his breath, "They're gonna pin these deaths on me too." However, no one knew for certain that the girls were dead. Everyone hoped that they had just run away, especially since Melissa was considered a tomboy by her relatives. Their bodies were found a few months later in the woods next to Highway 20. They were found in rather a strange place, next to the last exit, right in front of the part of the highway where the crew were working that day. By then, discovering human remains on Highway 20 had become fairly commonplace for the police. For example, in 1976, the skull of an unidentified girl was found, and another in 78. In the same year, the remains of certain Elizabeth Moslin were found, and the year before, the belongings of two missing teenagers, a girl and a boy. There was no evidence linking Ackroyd to these cases, but circumstantial evidence suggested that he might be involved. The problem was that in those years, another criminal was operating in that area, making things more complicated for the police. But let's return to focus on Ackroyd, who was behaving very strangely. One day, Richenda's cousin, the 15-year-old Jennifer, asked Ackroyd to drive her to a friend's house. They drove in the direction of Sweet Home. On the way, Ackroyd stopped the car, turned to Jennifer and said, "You know, you could kill somebody and hide a body here, and nobody would ever find it." After that, he got out of the car, saying he needed to go to the toilet. He invited Jennifer to go with him, but something told her that it was better to stay in the car. Ackroyd went alone and was gone for more than 15 minutes. Jennifer believes that he actually went to visit Richenda. Ackroyd's colleagues made no secret of the fact that they considered him guilty of Richenda's disappearance. Because of this, he was transferred to another department in the town of Sweet Home, but his bad reputation followed him there too. George Johnson, the owner of the highway equipment warehouse in Sweet Home, was not happy that Ackroyd became his colleague. Back in '79, when they first met, George didn't like Ackroyd. Now in his new role, Ackroyd was left on his own. He didn't communicate with anyone, and none of his colleagues knew where he was or what he was doing during the day. He could safely drive around in his work truck and do whatever he wanted, occasionally answering calls about problems on Highway 20 and supposedly monitoring the highway. Despite his free schedule, one day around the time Melissa and Sheila disappeared, he came to the warehouse late in the evening, apparently expecting nobody to be there. But he miscalculated. Two of his colleagues were there, and Ackroyd was covered in blood. When his colleagues saw him and asked what had happened, he said that he hit a deer on the road. And decided to butcher it right there on the spot. It was late at night, and this was a very strange explanation. His colleagues said that usually if someone gets into such a situation, they would simply drag the deer to the side of the road and drive on. His colleagues also said that Ackroyd spoke unflatteringly about women. He considered them to be the cause of all the wars in the world, and often said that a few less women in the world would be a good thing. Basically, John Ackroyd had all the classic hallmarks of a serial killer. Besides the way he treated women, he was a hunter who loved guns, and as a child, he was violent towards weaker children. As an adult, he hunted unaccompanied or helpless women whom no one would look for. As we know, several skulls found in the forest were not even identified. He loved control, and perhaps for the sake of feeling in control, he committed all these terrible crimes. On June 12, 1992, John Ackroyd was finally arrested. He and his friend Roger Beck, who once confirmed his alibi and turned out to be an accomplice during the investigation, were accused of kidnapping Kay Turner, who went running on that winter morning. Ackroyd, knowing of the impending arrest, prepared well. He got rid of some personal belongings and also gave several interviews, blaming Beck for everything. However, Roger Beck, or rather his friends and relatives, gave the police some new leads. As it turned out, Beck often told them about how he had attacked Kay Turner with Ackroyd. But despite this, both men had alibis provided by Beck's ex-wife, Pam, who was probably covering for them. When the police paid her a visit, she confessed, "I've been lying this whole time." Neither Beck nor Ackroyd had an alibi, of course. In fact, they returned home covered in blood and without a captured deer. Entering the house, Beck ordered Pam to burn all his clothes and even his new boots. Pam was afraid of Beck and did everything he asked. The police carried out various investigative experiments to understand exactly what happened on that ill-fated morning. In the end, they were able to prove that it was Ackroyd and Beck who abducted the girl and that everything happened in the morning. The woman's watch had to be wound every day so they could accurately determine the time of the incident. Analyzing her clothes, they discovered that Kay had died from stab wounds in a gunshot. Her clothes had been cut open just like the jeans of Marlene Gabrielson, the survivor. The trial began soon. One of the witnesses was Jane Morris, a girl who also went for a run that morning near the campsite, near where Kay was staying. She didn't see Ackroyd that morning, but had met him face to face a month earlier. This is what happened. She was riding her bicycle when she passed Ackroyd, who was standing next to his pickup truck. He pulled a gun from the trunk and ordered her to stop. She pedaled away with all her might, zigzagging across the road, knowing that it's more difficult to hit a moving object. Ackroyd didn't shoot, and she managed to get away. At the trial, Jane recognized him, a strong piece of evidence. The prosecutor did not have any physical evidence of Ackroyd's involvement, but the jury was allowed to listen to the tapes of his interrogations, where he often confused his testimony and sometimes blatantly lied. That was the last straw. Finally, in 1992, John Ackroyd was found guilty and sentenced to 5 life sentences. After 18 years, in 2010, he began to wonder about the possibility of parole, but then at the suggestion of Richanda's brother, Byron, the district attorney began to collect evidence that he had taken a Richanda. Then Ackroyd made a deal. He did not confess, but he did not deny his guilt either. This meant that there could be no parole, and Ackroyd would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But he never showed the place where Richanda's remains lay. He died in prison in 2016, taking all his secrets to the grave, and he insisted on his innocence until the end. Roger Beck, his accomplice in at least one attack, also tried to get released before the end of his sentence, but was refused. All this could have been avoided if the police had listened to Marlene Gabrielson and arrested Ackroyd the first time. Even if he had not been arrested, he would have been brought into the station, and the detectives would have had a very different attitude towards him on subsequent occasions. To date, Ackroyd is considered the most dangerous serial killer in Oregon, and investigators believe that he could be responsible for dozens of lives. The only witnesses are the asphalt on Highway 20 and the surrounding forests. Unfortunately, the police couldn't prove his involvement in the disappearances of other girls. Of course, this wouldn't bring back the dead, but it would at least bring some consolation to the families. What do you think about this case? Why didn't the police believe Marlene? And how can we prevent awful stories like this from happening again? If you liked this video, please share it with your friends and make sure to check out my other videos. Stay safe.